Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to welcome to this week's show Amanda Janoo. Hello, Amanda.
Hi. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'm looking forward to talking with you. And if anyone's been sleeping under a rock lately and do not know that Amanda is the Democratic candidate for the primary coming up on August 11th, she is running against Allie Richards. And she has worked nationally and internationally in the world of economics. She's worked for the UN and she is currently with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And grew up in Vermont, has returned like many of us who grew up here and then came home again. Um, Here to now run as governor. That seems like an interesting trajectory for me,
Mhm.
Amanda. What was that moment for you when you're like, okay, I'm gonna do this?
Yeah. Well, I think I don't know how it was for you, but the first 100 days of the Trump administration were
Which
really,
one?
yeah, this like past what I've never been a very anxious person. I've been really blessed, I guess, with, pretty, I would say, like stable, chill kind of nervous system, mental health. And I was really like chronically anxious about the state of our
Mm,
political situation. I was like, all right, well, this is game over, just watching all of these compounding crises, whether that's like, obviously the rise of fascism, whilst we have AI and climate change and economic crisis. We're in like an extreme economic crisis, and I do think it's going to get worse.
mm.
And then I
Yay.
also was, I know, I'm starting this out with a bit of a bummer. And, that sort of saying where, the best antidote to despair is action.
Hmm.
Very much feeling like I've spent so much of my career in life being inspired by Vermont values and the ways that I've worked on economic policy and governance reform, and also the importance of states in this moment to be able to not only like push back against this administration, but also illustrate a different way forward. And
Hmm.
really feeling like Vermont, like we have like all of the pieces for an alternative vision of like what our economy and our democracy can look like that I think can serve as an inspiration for the rest of the nation. And so if there's ever a moment to sort of stand up and go for it, it felt like this is the one. And so yeah, I decided to run for governor. And I will say it has been so helpful, like definitely no longer anxious, very hopeful actually, just through this process of connecting with so many folks all across the state who are similarly just yearning to be part of something that feels proactive right now as opposed to
Mm.
reactive.
Well, one thing I have found interesting when I've heard you talk and when I was going through your website looking at your platform, um, you know, the economy
Mm,
and economics in general is something that I think a lot of people feel happens to them.
yes.
And it is set in stone, and the rules are set in stone, and forever it shall be.
Hmm.
And when I've gone through your platform, you seem to talk about the economy and economics as um something that is can be evolved and can be changed and can serve the world differently.
Hmm.
Am I seeing that correctly? What's your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I feel like you nailed it, Olga. Yeah. So I do think a lot of that came from growing up in rural Vermont, honestly,
Hmm.
where it's like, in like a small town that I grew up, like most of the people I knew were carpenters and farmers and nurses and teachers. And it's sort of, you really realize that like strong communities aren't built by like some distant, like big investor or billionaire. It's just built by the people who know how to build stuff and fix stuff and grow stuff and care for one another. And I think that's how I really realized that like we are the economy. And
Mm-hmm.
so I often just say like the economy is just a word for the way that we produce and provide for one another. right? And ultimately, that system should always be judged by its contribution to our collective quality of life. And so, with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, for example, like a lot of the work has been around recognizing that right now, like our economy is being evaluated by like stock market values, right? Or like
Mm.
GDP growth rates. And our stock market's doing great. Okay. But the majority of people can't afford basic needs. So clearly there's something wrong with how we're evaluating our economic success. And so I think that that's a lot of it of like, what do we really want our economy like to achieve? Because it's a means and it's not an ends in and of itself. And right now I think we're treating it like it's a goal.
Interesting. So what are some of the measurements we're using now in the
Mm,
Vermont economy, and are what would you look at as measurements to evaluate the Vermont economy?
yeah. So, I mean, I will say like Vermont has been actually like kind of a leader in the sense that we adopted this like genuine progress index, for
Hmm.
example, that we like still calculate annually to look at not just like what is our sort of GDP growth rate, but accounting for both social contributions that are often outside of the realm as well as like environmental impacts, et cetera. It's still within a monetary value, right?
Right.
That we're orienting, but as part of like the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, one of the sort of claims to fame, I would say, is the foundation of the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership, which is a coalition of six governments: New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, Scotland, Wales, and Canada right now. Although I know I think Ireland's planning to join and
Mm.
maybe Brazil. But they've all developed alternative national performance frameworks that are based in indicators that center like social and ecological well-being. And they do look different. Like the process that they went about developing them, similarly, like the way that they articulated is different. But I think that there are some common threads, right? Like, which is, one which is just around like quality of life, right? Like, are people have like strong connections and trust and economic security and the basic sort of foundations and around equity, like thinking about what is the distribution of that across groups and then the sustainability of it as well, in terms of environmental and also in terms of like longer term approaches. But I think in Vermont it's really important that we go through that process together of being clear on like what is it that we really want to be achieving longer term as a society, because right now it's not clear to me what the goal of the government is. And I think that's why we keep being stuck in this like reacting to stuff all the
Interesting.
time, as opposed to having some North Star to which to orient like our policy investments, decision making, etc.
Thank you for saying that, Amanda, because I think one thing I often find fascinating when I'm having conversations with people is quite often we will say something like, um, we have a high quality of life in Vermont, or we need Vermont to be more affordable, or whatever, but we never actually define what that looks like.
Yes.
And so I think it allows us, just on a very practical level, to keep talking around each other and creating in circles without actually directing our focus and directing our energy towards specific outcomes.
Yes. 100%. Yeah, couldn't agree with you more there. Because it is, right? Like, and also there's very different understandings of what any of those terms are going to mean. So that is helpful to ensure that there's like specificity, but also accountability, right? Like
Mhm.
to achieve them. And so, one of my favorite examples, because it's also about the process, right? Like it's both about the goals and the process. I love that quote, like the process we use to get to the future is the future we get. And
Hmm.
so I think one of my favorite processes was Wales went through this, like asking all of their citizens, like, what kind of Wales do you want to leave for your children and grandchildren? And on that basis, articulated these longer term well-being goals, which are centered in like health and equity, community, culture, global responsibility to biodiversity and prosperity. And took that next step though of not just like articulating them, but actually setting clear 25-year targets. So for the next generation. and then requiring like a whole of government transformation to be held accountable to its achievement by creating a future generations commissioner who's semi-autonomous and whose tenure is always longer than any political administration or cycle to
Oh,
hold the government
interesting.
to account. Yes. So what it meant, like in practice, was, you know, it's not like the health agency is just in responsible for health. All of government is responsible for achieving all of the goals. And so when they wanted to build a highway through the country, for example, they needed to make the case for how it would contribute to all seven goals. And
Hmm.
when they couldn't make the case for contributing to any of the goals except for maybe one, they put a permanent freeze on all new road development. So all that money would go into public transportation and active travel because they could see that as clearly contributing to like a healthier, more equitable, more globally responsible, et cetera, whales, right? And so that's why it's so important. It becomes a reference point for decision making, which I think also ensures we are all like sort of rowing in a similar direction, even if we want, it's important to try different approaches, right? Like and strategies, but understanding and evaluating, are we headed where we're trying to get?
Hmm. Um, I've heard of the of whales going through that process, and it I always thought that was very interesting. One of my concerns, though, is we have 2-year gubernatorial
Mm-hmm.
terms, and for the legislature and the Senate as well, or the House and the Senate as well. So how would you, if you were elected governor, how would you put that planning process and that visioning process in place if you only had 2 years to get it done?
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's where I will say, like, it's been wonderful that I've been working on this also in Vermont already, right? Like,
Mhm.
so been part of an incredible coalition that is, the Vermont Councils for Rural Development that does all of
Yeah.
this participatory community-led visioning processes, right? Like the Sustainable Jobs Fund, like the that help to, double local food consumption through a whole networked strategy, right? And is very well skilled in understanding that kind of convening, or the UVM Gund Institute, which are brilliant, like ecological
Hmm.
economists who also were the ones who created the Genuine Progress Index, right? Like, and so bringing together a lot of different strategic actors who can help, right? Like to really think about how do we best organize that process and then like instill that within government because then it doesn't become just about me in a 2-year term, right? Like
Hmm.
this would be something that continues across a wide range of different like political administrations and cycles, so that no matter what, like Vermonters feel like their priorities are being heard, and seen, and that's like the orientation. And I think it also provides an opportunity to redistribute more resources and power actually back to local communities for them to be able to design the kinds of strategies that make most sense for their context to achieve them.
Hmm. Well, I think that brings me to another kind of big picture question is, as you've been going around the state and talking to people, in that idea of what do you want, how is Vermont working or not working for people, um, what's emerged for you? Are there issues that have emerged for you? Are there myths and stories that have emerged? Yeah.
Yeah. So as I've been going around the state, I always start each event by asking folks, what are the things that you're most proud of in your
Mhm.
community? And I do that because, in from my experience working in economic development, so often it starts from a deficit or a scarcity mindset
Mm,
that
fair.
assumes that we are poor or we are struggling because we lack something, that we lack enough people or investment or skills or like corporations, whatever it is, rather than starting with what is it that we already have? Like, what are our strengths, and our skills and our incredible, connections, and believing that the solutions to our crises are already here. They're already being
Mm,
practiced, and that the role of government is to really help nurture and spread and provide the tools and resources and support that is needed to like amplify those. And so through that process, I think beginning with more of that like strength-based approach as opposed to, a problem statement It's been just so beautiful. Like, honestly, I've just been gathering like all of these incredible examples from all over the state of not only just like remarkable innovations or like solutions, but also a better sense of, because in like when you get to the Q&A section, like of course you hear similar things, which is, concerns around healthcare and housing and education and democracy, etc. But often when we talk about what are the things you're most proud of, so often it relates to social connection,
Hmm.
like community, the ways that like we show up for one another. Like people love their libraries. Yeah, like the libraries are coming up as just like
Hmm.
in this moment of an epidemic of loneliness for a lot of towns, libraries are the ones who are like becoming critical third spaces that are organizing a lot of initiatives or opportunities to like bring people together. I was just doing an event where somebody was like, yeah, one of the things I'm proud of is like, yeah, pretty much everybody in my town has helped to like catch somebody's stray dog. You know what I mean? At one time or another, or and it's just yeah. So that has been, I think, the common thread I've heard over and over is just that kind of how much we love our communities and the way our
Hmm.
communities show up for each other and how no matter what people want to do, they can find other people who are willing to do it with them. And
Right.
that sort of level of civic engagement, community volunteerism, that is something really special in our state.
Hmm. And it is very special. I think it is something that makes Vermont unique. Um, and wonderful. I'm not sure though that we can ignore the fear that people are feeling right now. Um, and you talked about starting from a place of strength, which I agree with. However, where do you see some of the weaknesses in the Vermont economy? For example, when I look at the economy, one thing I'm concerned about is I feel we have a lot of mono economies across the state. So, like, I'm in the Deerfield Valley, and it's so reliant on tourism, which is,
Mm-hmm.
fine. Tourism is can be a great economic driver, but it's not necessarily should be the only economic driver in an area. And I feel like our economy is actually quite thin that way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious for you, what when you look at the Vermont landscape, you're like, ooh, we could do better here, we could do better there.
100%. That's a great, yeah, that's a really important one because I've thought about that also too. Like, tourism is a very, I would say, fragile, right? Foundation for an economy because it is really dependent on a lot of other people, right? In
Yeah.
terms of, and often service sector jobs are not often the best paying jobs. And so for me, that's part of this, like I would say the fear is not unfounded that people
Hmm.
are feeling right now. And I want to just acknowledge that. And so there's a part of me that feels a bit like a collective prepper. Yeah, where I'm like, this is our moment, especially economically, that we need to get back to some of the basics and make sure we're producing enough of the things we need here. And we're really being strategic in how we're bolstering like the most critical sort of sectors in our economy to
Hmm.
build really diverse but also resilient economic systems that can weather whatever is ahead. And so food, healthcare, housing, energy, transportation, communication, like just getting sort of education, like getting back to some of those basics and really making sure that that is sort of the foundational crux of our economy so that we
Hmm.
can keep, first of all, more money circulating within our local economy because you're selling back to each other, right? Which is
Yeah.
important for some of those like multiplier effects. And it ensures that no matter what happens, whether it's a financial crisis or, like military dictatorship, whatever it is, like we're going to be okay in the sense that like we have what we need to
Hmm.
make sure that we can, yeah, feel secure moving forward.
And what's your thoughts on how we make that happen? I
Mhm.
think one of the kind of chicken and egg things I see communities wrestle with is that for a government, taxing is one of its main
Mhm.
tools for doing things. However, I think because Vermont does have some fragile parts of its economy, there's not something coming up and growing.
Mm,
And so
hmm.
taxes feel like I'm so mixing metaphors, but it can feel, I think, for a lot of people that taxes are like cutting away the tree
Mm,
and the tree's not growing.
mm,
Um, of our economic tree. So yeah, how do we kind of build an economic forest?
yeah.
I guess is sort of my weird roundabout question.
No. I- so in my like past life, I worked in industrial policy for
Mm,
like almost a decade. And so that was a lot of exactly this sort of question where sort of old school economic development policy in the sense that I would say since the 80s, like there's been like neoliberalism, right? Like, and the idea that the role of government is just to create some sort of general business enabling environment. Let
right.
anything and everything grow as quickly as possible, and then the government can come in and tax some of that and then fix any damages after the fact, rather than
Mm,
being intentional about, like, okay, so which types of economic activities do we really want to grow and foster and support, and which are the ones that we might want to like discourage or sunset, right? And so that's where if we're talking about food, for example, like we're very blessed, right? Like we have incredible working lands. We've had this farm to plate initiative that helped to double local food consumption. There's a clear strategy already for the whole New England region, which is how we can increase self-sufficiency for like the whole, yeah, New England region. And so there's clarity around like what kind of support they need, right? And
mhm,
right now we're just not providing the kind of funding and resourcing that is necessary to our farmers and to like our food local food ecosystem that is necessary to just bolster up and like strengthen those systems and ensure that everybody who is within our like agricultural and like food systems have a good quality of life and have like the kind of support that they need in order
mhm,
to yeah increase that level of production and sufficiency here. So like there's a lot of stuff that's already here. I would say it's just about of all of the stuff that we can be providing tax incentives or not to, are we orienting them towards the most critical sectors? Because right now, I do think Phil Scott, and to be fair, it hasn't just been Phil Scott. I would say it's been Democrat and Republican governors for decades
mhm,
who have really kept this. Like, we just want a lot of incentives for external investors and businesses and people to come here, because that's been a lot of the dominant idea, as opposed to, okay, let's really orient and focus on how we encourage and support our local businesses and
mhm.
producers and communities in this moment.
Thank you. Yes, I am often amazed at the small businesses that are
Mhm.
cooking along in the Vermont economy very quietly, just sort of chugging along. Many of them are sole entrepreneurs or solopreneurs, I
Hmm.
guess they call them,
Hmm.
or one or two people. Um,
Yeah.
but
Well, sorry.
no, go ahead.
No, definitely. And I feel like Vermonters, that's the other thing that comes up a lot, I guess, that I hear about. Like we're incredibly creative, a very creative, innovative, like community here. And
Hmm.
that is both in terms of arts and culture, but also in terms of business and innovation. Like we have seen like some of the most incredible innovative businesses, both huge, right? Like whether that's something like Beta that's trying to like totally revolutionize all of airline travel to, really incredible, like as you say, like 72% of our businesses are actually sole proprietors.
Hmm.
And so we have a lot of folks who are just like, yeah, thinking about really innovative new ways to not only do business, but in a way that serves their communities, like first and foremost. And so that's where I think some of my focus is as well. The reason why you want to support and foster like local business and innovation is because even if, they become big or they stay small, they're much less likely to just like pick up and move out. as soon as like there's a change in some tax structure or whatever, because they see themselves as part of a larger community that isn't
Mm,
just here to like take advantage of whatever kind of resources or tax incentives exist already. And I do think that that's one of the areas like beyond just like basic needs that I think Vermont can be a leader of the economy of the future, which is around like what I would frame as like green industrial policy, but a lot of it is being a leader in the circular and regenerative economy of the future.
mhm,
Because whether or not like our governor or our president are in denial about climate change, we cannot keep producing things the way that we're producing them with the level of waste, with the planned obsolescence. And we already have so many businesses here that have lifetime warranties because they believe, right? Like in the
mhm,
importance of some durability or who like regenerative farming, right? Because they see the power that farming can have to not only like keep us fed and connect us, but also to actually heal our landscape and, things like I mentioned sometimes like Bar Hill Gin, right? Like part of their
mhm.
mission is pollinator regeneration, and they like take the heat from their distillation process to heat their buildings. And so I think these are the kind of things where I am a little worried. Like we have a trade deficit as a state, but I think if we
Mm,
invest in
mhm.
this is that can actually be a leader both nationally and internationally in terms of the kinds of production and products that I think the global market will be demanding.
So I think for what would you say to folks? I sent you an email when we were prepping for the show, and I think I used the phrase under the very unscientific headline of people who happen to have called me and asked me questions. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
a theme I've heard from some folks though is, you know, a circular economy is great.
Mm-hmm.
Healthcare for all is great.
Mm-hmm.
But it's impractical. We can't afford it. And all it's going to mean is I'm going to pay even higher taxes and I will have to leave the state.
Mm.
And, I think sometimes those comments come from, um, there's been a lot of times where I think our legislature has had very good intentions and tried to create some very good policy, but maybe it hasn't done what they had wanted it to.
Mm-hmm.
Or other places have done something similar and it's basically failed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's just worry and concern and a feeling that these things are great, but they're not actually possible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
what would you say to that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do, I was mentioning a lot of the crises or threats we face, but I do think probably the biggest challenge we face right now is cynicism.
Hmm.
You know, because it is. I do think that some of the reason we're even in this situation politically is because people have lost faith in government and its capacity
Hmm.
to actually do anything to meaningfully improve their lives. That it's just, I think
Yeah.
we either view the government as just like a henchman of like economic elites and corporate interests, or as just like something that just, will raise taxes, add some more complexity, and then not actually deliver on anything that materially and immediately seems like it's actually improved your life. And my dad worked for the Army Corps of Engineers, and their motto during World War II was like, the difficult we do now, the impossible will take some time. And I think that has to be our motto right now as a state,
Hmm.
because if we are not willing to be ambitious and to like shoot for the best scenario we can imagine, we're never even going to try to make any progress towards it. And I get the cynicism. Like I've worked in so many governments and I know how the system itself kind of wears you down
Hmm.
in many ways. And yet I've also worked with so many governments that have done remarkable things, and have like even the example of Wales, like that's a really tiny country that has inspired the world in terms of a different vision of governance. And that is like has been applied to more and more countries around the world in its different forms. And so like just because we're small does not mean that we can't be ambitious. In fact, I think provides us an opportunity to be more so. And so yeah, that would be my response to that thought, because none of the stuff I would say I'm proposing is honestly like that radical. Yeah. It's like, oh, bringing back some small town doctors to our communities. Okay, like towns are already doing it. It's not that expensive and it's not actually wouldn't be that hard, right? Or
Hmm.
similarly, it's like taxing, Airbnbs and luxury estates and private equity, whatever, like putting the taxation in those economic activities or behaviors that you want to discourage, so you
Hmm.
can actually shift it to reduce the tax burden for folks who actually live here. And I think that's where maybe, again, because of my background in economic policy, I don't think of taxes as just like a way to generate revenue. I think about it as a way you discourage behavior. And so that
Hmm.
even for me, honestly, like if I had a magic wand, like a lot of the things I would like us to move from income taxes to more wealth taxes, right? Like, because
Okay.
actually, I
Interesting.
don't think we should be discouraging people working. I think a
Hmm.
lot of the driver of inequality right now is that it's easier to just make money off of money than it is real work, right? And so, like,
Right.
where we are putting the tax burden should be reflective of the kinds of behaviors that, like, we want to discourage in some way.
Interesting. Thank you, Amanda. We are out of time for this first half. It went like that.
Ah,
Um, so hang tight, folks. We're going to hear from some underwriters here on WVEW, LP Brattleboro, and then Amanda Janoo and I will return in a moment. Hey there, welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. If you're just joining us, I am your host and producer, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with primary gubernatorial candidate Amanda Janoo, who is running on the Democratic ticket for the primary, which is happening on August 11th. So if you haven't voted early, make sure I hope, I can't tell people what to do, Amanda, but I hope folks will go to their town clerk or to their voting booths by August 11th. Um, because Olga's little soapbox here, this is where you actually have the most choice, folks,
mm,
because whether it is Amanda Janoo who wins the August 11th primary or it's Allie Richards, they will be your Democratic candidate for the November election. So this is where you have choice. So I hope folks exercise that. Before we dive back into our conversation with Amanda, I just want to thank BCTV for taking the video version of this show and sharing it with media centers around the state, as well as remind folks that the views and opinions of everyone at the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the hosts and the guests, and no one else, not the platforms, not our bosses, not our best friends, not our employers, not our colleagues. Did I forget anyone, Amanda?
I don't know. This seems comprehensive.
Yes, we will take responsibility all for ourselves. Um, so Amanda, thank you for the first half of this conversation. I've really found it interesting just talking about Vermont and its systems and its economy. But I want to revisit something you said that just caught my attention, which was, you're taught when you've been talking about um, your work internationally. Um, and your work with many different governments. And it kind of made me wonder, given how many governments you've worked with, um, and I think you said sometimes that system can grind you down.
Hmm.
Why are you throwing yourself into a government system?
Yeah. Well, I feel like I'm a relentless optimist, I will say, like, because even when, you know, I would say probably the most like grindy one was when I was like working at the UN, and
Hmm.
I was younger, right? Like, so I definitely got more often this sort of like, well, that's naive. That'll never happen.
Oh
Like,
dear.
and like that sort of like brush off in terms of this, like,
Hmm.
but why? Why not? Right? Like it can happen. And I think that for me, I've always been a but why person. Yeah. And I do like I believe I really believe in people. Like I like
Mhm.
people. I think that we can do incredible things and that we have what it takes to be able to navigate like the challenges ahead of us and to like build a better world. And I think that for me, in all honesty, I started to flirt with a little nihilism last
Mm,
year. And that was kind of scary for me because I don't know why I've always been an optimist, but I always have. It was just like I was like sort of born that way. And when I started to feel a bit of that like hopelessness,
mhm.
I it was a bit of an identity crisis or something, right? And I was like, we're gonna have to do something about this. And I had, already been working over, in recent years a lot with states and like in the US, like focused on state level sort of movement building, coalitions, government
Mhm.
policy transformations, and just sort of seeing how it was maybe fortuitous, right? That I'd already been sort of focused more in the state level, doing stuff here in Vermont, and then in this moment where it felt like the federal government had just like lost its mind, being like, okay, this is the moment, and it really isn't like I've got some long-term like political calculation or ambition. I was just like, I don't know what the world's going to look like in 2 years. And if there is ever a moment to do something, it feels like right now, for states to like stand up and to illustrate a different way forward. And I'm obviously biased, but I think Vermont's the best. And like if any state can do it, like
Well,
it's got to be
yeah.
Vermont, But it's just, yeah, this isn't a situation where like if we keep our heads down, this is going to resolve itself on its own, like
Mhm.
this stops if we stop it. And if we're willing to sort of lean in this moment, and this is something I can offer, right? Like, and I can do, and really felt like no matter what the outcome, the power of a campaign can also be to like socialize and build demand for like a more ambitious agenda to bring people together to like sort of help with more statewide organizing. And so no matter what, we're better like connected and prepared for what's to come. So that
Mm.
was sort of my thinking in the beginning. And then obviously, yeah, it's going very well. So, I'm psyched about it. And yeah, feeling, excited, you never know. But I feel like
Mhm.
we could really win this. So that's great.
And have you given thought to, if you are elected governor, what you would do first?
Mm, yeah. I mean, I do think to your point earlier around the cynicism, that I
Hmm.
think one of the most important things to do is to be able to immediately show some material, immediate positive like impact from the government,
Yeah.
right? And so this is where I think one that's really easy but is important is roads. Yeah, like if people could
Oh,
just
yes.
see
Everybody
that like
hates a
some of their
pothole.
physical infrastructure in their daily lives, is
Hmm.
looking better. That makes a big difference. And I think also with like the healthcare proposal, the nice thing about it is, it's scalable. It's not that expensive, but if you bring back like small town, like nurses, doctors, et cetera, that people can immediately start to go see for free, like that's something that they can see in their community as a like immediate sort of positive contribution of the state. And so I think those things are important as you also then look at like broader like the governance sort of reform work. And I've been clear, for example, that like in terms of, one of the really important roles of governor is the cabinet, right? Like who you
Mhm.
end up putting in these like senior leadership positions because
That's a good point.
yeah, that's so huge. And I would say again, the thing that always gives me faith in government is like I've always worked much more in the executive branches where it's like mid-level civil servants. And there would give me hope in government because they're always just like good people who want to
Mhm.
help, and it's like the political election side is, I also good people, but it's a different sort of vibe. And I know that one of the most frustrating things for anybody who works in government is when a new executive comes in and they just appoint their biggest donors, their friends, their like strategic stakeholders to these, cabinet positions, even if they don't have any
Fair.
experience in the sector, they don't have any experience with the agency,
Yes.
and so I think it's really important, especially because right now folks in the state agencies are burnt out. Yeah,
Yeah.
like there's been so much continuous cuts in terms of these like positions, but not reallocation of the roles, lack of like vision and like orientation. And I think, obviously there's the realities of just the workload, but then there's a sense of just agency and power also. So I want to make sure folks in government are part of that nomination and selection process too, right? So we're clear on what are the criteria skills and the types of people we're looking for in Vermont to fill those, and then really make sure that they feel like they're part of the selection of the person who's going to be leading
Hmm.
them moving forward. Because that kind of, yeah, again, coming from more like bottom up and recognizing the wisdom and experience that's already there.
Um, Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm having one of my moments where the brain's going in multiple directions
I
and I
love
can't
that.
grab any of the thoughts fast enough. Um, you know, One thing you said makes me think about something I think about a lot is in Vermont, I sometimes feel like there is a tension between local control and state control. And
Hmm.
part of that I think exists because of we are a Dillon's rule state.
Yes.
And so we just bump up against that for better or for worse. But I also wonder too about things like economies of scale. And so you mentioned um, bringing back small town doctors.
Hmm.
And yet my immediate reaction was, well, that's so interesting because it feels like our healthcare system has spent a lot of time consolidating. And so you do have these like Dartmouth has so many satellites and so many hospitals in Vermont are now actually part of Dartmouth.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but it I guess I'm wondering like what's the balance in Vermont because we do want to have local control like
Hmm.
with our schools.
Hmm.
And yet there is this thought that we can get economies at scale
Yeah.
at the state level that we can't get at the local level. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh, I love that you're asking this question, because I would say it's a lot of it is at like the heart of the like fundamental philosophy in this campaign, because
Hmm.
I do see, I think all of the various sort of crises we're facing is a result of too much concentration of
Oh,
wealth and power. And I
okay.
think that that is both in like corporations, but also in the government, right? And like we're seeing
Hmm.
what happens like at the national level when those two things happen, and sort of like the collusion and corruption. And I think a lot of it is about a decentralization of more power and decision making. And so I really believe in the role of the state, right? But I think it needs to be in service of community, right? As opposed to
Hmm.
it being like the dictator of community. And so yeah, would be a big advocate for moving from the Dillon's rule to the home rule, for example, because again, going around the state, like seeing how many of like the solutions are coming from the local level, but then and also, at least in my lifetime, I feel like I've witnessed a lot more power being concentrated in Montpelier, but the local communities are the ones who are left to deal with all of the crises and the damage, and they don't have the resources or the decision making to do
Yeah.
it, right? And it's not
Unfunded
fair.
mandates.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and I do believe that like if given more space and power and autonomy and like support and the resources, it will ultimately actually save a lot more money. Yeah. And
Mhm.
it will also allow for much more contextual and appropriate types of solutions to kind of the crises we're facing, as opposed to like, I mean, we've seen both through the education sort of discussions this year and through 181. Like, I think
Mm.
people are clearly frustrated with these maps that feel like they're coming from the heavens, that they're not a part of developing and demanding to have more of a voice, right? Like they
Mm.
want to feel like they are being heard in terms of what matters for their community and their context. And so that's where, yeah, this more of this decentralization of like power and decision making. And it doesn't mean that, like, again, I think we all need to be clear on like what as a state, as a collective, we are trying to achieve together, because
Mhm.
that's really important. But then trusting and empowering communities to develop the kinds of strategies and approaches that are going to make most sense to get there.
Hmm. So that leads me to another, just a very practical question, is that if we do make that shift,
Hmm.
let's say to home rule, to more local control,
Yeah.
um, I also see towns and another unevenness
Hmm.
in Vermont is that some towns have a lot of capacity. Their
Yes.
government, they
Yeah.
have full staff, they have a police department and a fire department and, a town manager. And then some towns, it's a five-member select board and a road boss,
Yeah.
and that's it.
Hmm.
Um, and given how complex a lot
Yeah.
of issues are right now, I do sometimes feel that these smaller towns are really struggling to keep up with just the basic things like keeping the lights on.
Yeah.
So if we are going to transfer more power to the local level, how are we also going to transfer capacity and skill sets and
Mhm.
resources?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is why I do think like I really believe in the importance of like state agencies, right? And the
Mhm.
government, because I do think it's important that you have specialists and experts, for example, that exist. Like I don't think that everything, you know what I mean, like should just
Mhm.
be like broken up, but the focus should be on like providing that support. Right? Like to the communities around the areas or issues and like providing the kinds of like whether that's technical assistance or like administrative or whatever it is to sort of navigate the system. But I also do think it's important that we streamline and reduce some of the complexity and hoops that we
Mhm.
expect small towns to be going through. Um, some things we don't have control over, like federal, like funds often have like really brutal kind of, reporting and, administrative requirements that we can support towns to navigate. But we could also, for anything state level, provide more block grants, for example, right? Like that are
Mhm.
not like don't come with so many like strings attached or reporting requirements or whatever, right? Like that provide a little bit more of that flexibility for folks to do what yeah, they need.
Thank you. Um, uh, Along the same lines of the local control versus state control kind of tension, the other thing I find very interesting, we touched on this a little bit in the first half, but I'd like to really focus on it now, is it does feel when I'm covering a discussion at a town level, this came up with 181 a lot, was, someone in the meeting will say, I'm struggling. I can't make it.
Mm,
The state's pulling more taxes from me or, making it harder for me to run my business, whatever it is.
mhm,
And someone else will say, yeah, but we have a really high quality of life in Vermont, so I'm willing to sacrifice X, Y, and Z for that high quality of life. But it's starting to feel to me a couple things like one, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but like, are we actually sacrificing things for this idea of quality of life that maybe are hurting our quality of life? Or why can't we have a strong economy and a high quality of life? Like, why is it one or the other? So I just love your thoughts on that.
yeah. Oh, there's so much which is in that. And so now I'm having a moment of my brain going a thousand different places. And I'm like, okay, which string do we want to like sort of orient here? Because I do think that like really comes back to fundamentally like the issue of how we have been like evaluating progress that
Mm,
pits the economy and our environment or our society as if they're like against each other. And I think some
mm,
of that honestly is because what I would call like an economic supremacy argument, which is like we treat people and planet as if they're here to serve the economy rather than
interesting.
recognizing the economy is here to serve us, right?
Mhm,
And so the thing is that it's important for us to start with, okay, to your point, like what do we mean by a good quality of life? And so that's why I do think it's important that we actually go through that participatory process to clearly articulate that. But what I will say, at least when I've been developing my platform and economic policies, my orientation point has been every time I ask Vermonters what they love about where they live, it's always the community and the natural beauty.
mhm,
Yeah, so like those are two things that people really seem to value a lot. So I keep that like in my orientation point. Is this going to be good for our community, right? Like our connection, our like, and is it going to be good for, our natural environment in some way as a starting point? Because I don't think that like transformative housing or whatever it is, it needs to be in conflict with those things. But I do think it changes the approach that you might take, which is also why I like with the healthcare, for example, like this idea of bringing back small town doctors was like, okay, well, this would be good for community, right? Because
Hmm.
it's gonna support, like rural economic development, like having more local access, like somebody who knows you as a person who's embedded in your community, as opposed to somebody who's just like at a hospital you go to every once in a while when you need, a prescription refill or whatever it is. Um, and so, yeah, like I sit with that. And I also, when we talk about like affordability, for example, like I'm a renter in Burlington,
Hmm.
right? Like, I mean, we talk about like yeah, and I don't identify myself as a young person, right? But I am that sort of like millennial age group where
Right.
I don't like envision that I will ever be able to own a home in Vermont if we don't do some serious housing reform.
Hmm.
There are just realities of what we have allowed to sort of maybe happen, which I actually, my belief is that a lot of that has been driven by an economies of scale
Hmm.
kind of assumption, right? Like we've allowed for a lot of sectors and this like to become their own sort of like monopolies in certain
Mm.
ways. And we tend to
Interesting.
preference like much larger developers, for example, relative to like smaller scale, like allowing just people, providing people with like making it easier for them to have building loans, right? Or to
Hmm.
be able to like renovate their own houses or et cetera, that kind of thing. And so, yes, of course, like there is economies of scale is a real thing, right? But I think you want to think about what are the areas where that's appropriate and where small is beautiful. Because the last time I think we did anything that was similar to this sort of like in my mind to this visioning process was in 2008. Like the Vermont Council for Rural Development did this
Yeah.
like value survey for
Hmm.
Vermont. And the values that came up were, yeah, community, environment, hard work, self-reliance, right? Like this sense that like we work hard and we like a certain level of like, taking care of ourselves. There was tolerance, right? Like a sense
Hmm.
of that we get along and we respect each other sort of across political ideologies, identities, etc., which I am wondering, you know what I mean? If like this was before I would say the total height of social media and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And smallness was one of them, right? Like we like small towns and small businesses and small government, and the fact that we know our representatives and that we know our neighbors and that like, you know what I mean? There's like a general store that like my
Hmm.
general store in Stratford, had these yellow like note cards that if you couldn't pay, you could just like charge it. You know what I mean? And then when you had
Hmm.
some money, you could go back, and it's like that's not going to happen at Maple Fields, okay? You know what I mean? Like, and so there is a difference, right? Like of what and things look like. And then the last value was Vermont. We love Vermont, right? And that's an important one I also want to flag here because that's the value, which I really hope we can lean into right now. It's like this sense of like a unified pride and
Hmm.
identity as a state that can help to ensure that across all of these like this administration in this moment is trying to divide us, right? Like it's trying to pit us against each other across a lot of different, whether that's class, like geography, identity, gender, etc. lines. And if we can hold on to this sense of like we are in this together, I think that's going to be huge to get us through.
Hmm. So, one thing again, under the unscientific
Yeah.
heading of people who have called me, um,
Hmm.
I find interesting is folks when they look at you as a potential governor, and I would say Ally too. I think this is true for both of you. There is this sense of, well, Scott, he's gotten us this far, so let's stay with the devil, or
Mm-hmm.
along the lines of, well, we don't that. we don't want our government to become unbalanced. And so it's
Yes.
good we have a
Yeah.
Republican governor if we're going to have a majority of Dems in the legislature. And so therefore I'm not too sure about either of these Dem candidates. I'd love to hear your response to that.
Hmm. Yeah, I appreciate this question because in some ways, like I'm reading something that's like a little bit even deeper than just like which I've thought about a lot in this moment when I think a lot of us are feeling really like insecure and like sort
Hmm.
of scared about the future. It's it can make us really resistant to change, right? Like we just want to hold on to anything we can feel like there's any certainty around. And it relates to somewhat I don't know. I feel like we're all a little bit collectively traumatized right now, honestly. I think
I
from
would agree with
COVID
that.
and now with like this federal administration, like our nervous systems are shot. We're in a state of fight or flight. And I think it's also making it hard for us to really think clearly or long term or,
Mhm.
like more systemically. And, I think a lot of that comes from when we have a lot of changes we don't feel like we have any control over.
Mhm.
But I think the healing comes in the changes that we do have control over.
Hmm.
And so being able to identify that, to feel agency over that, to feel like we can be like our fate is not given, that we get to choose the future that we want for ourselves. I think there's something really powerful in that. And I don't know, honestly, I don't think it's unfounded or unfair if people, like I want to, yeah, stick with like what they know in some way. But I do think that this moment in history will be determined by if we choose security or freedom,
Hmm.
and I don't know what we're going to choose, honestly, but I think it's important that we have the choice and then we, yeah, act accordingly to it. It's a little philosophical, but I don't know if you know what I mean here.
I
Yeah.
do, but I would love to hear,
Hmm.
again, in that sense of we use big words, but we don't always define them.
Yes. Yes.
How are you, in your mind, differentiating security and freedom?
Yeah. So I would say, I guess in my mind, what I see is I think Phil Scott's very much strategy is let's just keep our heads down and
Hmm.
hope that these situations resolve themselves on their own, right? And I don't think that they're going to resolve themselves on
Hmm.
their own. I think we are in a process of what I would call just managed decline and
Mm-hmm.
not preparing for a lot of the additional crises that are coming down the pipeline that we know and we can see are coming, right? And so
Right.
without that like preparation or actual response to the existing crises that we're facing, things are going to keep getting worse, right? And so for me, I think this is an opportunity again from being just reactive to starting to get proactive and to
Hmm.
believe and to see that like we have agency in this moment to not only solve the like healthcare or housing or education, whatever it is, immediate crises, but also to have power over things that feel really big and overwhelming, like AI, right? Or financial crisis or, authoritarianism. Like there are things that we can do in this moment to actually be powerful players in this moment in history to
Hmm.
ensure that we are building like a more resilient, democratic, and like prosperous future. But it does require us to take action, right? Because if we just sit here, yeah, things aren't going to get any better, I don't think.
Yeah. Uh, no change is not meaning we stay in the same place. It just means there's no change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, we're almost out of time. Oh my gosh. So many more questions I want to ask you. But I think the one I'll ask, and I asked Allie this question too, because it came up when you both had your debate on Vermont Public last week or the week before now. Um, and why it stood out to me is it sounded a little bit like how either of you might handle our relationship with the federal government.
Mm.
And
Hmm.
I believe, if I'm remembering it correctly, you said something along the lines of, well, we can withhold our federal taxes. We need to be more resilient in our relationship with the federal government. Maybe not so much of our state budget would come from the federal government, for example. If I'm remembering correctly, those were some of the lines of the conversation. So I would love to hear from you, like, what are your thoughts on
Mm,
our relationship with the federal government and moving forward?
mhm. Yeah, so maybe I'll just like clarify first of
Please
all
do.
also.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
gave a very broad overview
Yeah, yeah,
there.
yeah. Because I mean, we can't just withhold our federal taxes, but there are states that have been exploring what you can withhold is the equivalent to which you are owed,
Ah,
right? Like
okay,
so,
interesting.
so there's like explorations in terms of that as a potential, you know what I mean, strategy, etc., related to some of these more political targeted attacks on states that are sort of
Hmm.
happening by this administration. Yeah, I would say like so I've been part of this Fund Vermont's Future Coalition that has over recent years been looking at the Vermont tax structure, right? And how do
Yeah.
we reform the Vermont tax structure in order to make it more equitable, to reduce pressure on working class Vermonters, and also to generate the kind of revenue we need as a state. And in looking at that, I think some of my concern is how heavily dependent we are on the federal government in terms of our funding. Now, that does not mean like we 100% will want to work very closely with our federal delegation because Congress is the one who should, you know what I mean, controls the purse strings, right? Like, and so this is
Yeah.
not like about like an isolationism, but it is also about, again, to this point around preparation and preparing for things.
Hmm.
I just don't want Vermont under any situation to capitulate to this administration because of budgetary considerations, right?
Gotcha.
Because I do feel like I am not like I spent a lot of last year reading about like the rise of fascism in Europe in the 20th century. And the things like we're seeing what's happening, right? Like it's starting with immigrants and trans people. And, you know, like now there's classifications of communists or anti-tech people or whatever. And it's like it's gonna keep going. You know what
Hmm.
I mean? And it's important that there is no price at which we are willing to sell our neighbors to ICE, right? Or this
Hmm.
administration. And so what's important in that sense, right, is where when I look at the federal funding, like this is where it came from, a lot of it goes for healthcare, transportation, for example, right? Like, what are the sectors that were particularly vulnerable
Hmm.
in terms of that funding around? And so, how do we make sure we have state funded alternatives that don't require us to, like, you know, like capitulate? Because we saw the way that the federal government, for example, has been targeting Minnesota, or even just the level of Medicare cuts that have already happened, right? Like, I mean, we are headed into a pretty rough budgetary situation because of this administration either way. And so that's why we need, I think, more proactive economic strategies to bolster our core kind of production and self-sufficiency around these things so that we're not as vulnerable to yeah, this administration as a result.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Amanda. I appreciate that perspective. And I also appreciate you bringing up Congress because I do think sometimes as Americans we default to putting a lot of focus on the president when really we may want to be paying more attention to our Congress.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And we're really lucky, right? Like our congressional
Hmm.
like representatives are fantastic, you know? And so, and I know that they are fighting super hard in Washington for not just all Vermonters, but for like Americans in general. And really, and so hopeful, you know, with this midterm too, that hopefully like some of that shifts in certain ways. And so this is not about, you know, inherently, again, being isolationist. It's just about being resilient and ensuring we can stick to our values in this moment. And I do, you know, I've worked with a lot of governments on budgetary reforms and fiscal policies and things like this. And like, how do we make sure that we're planning accordingly?
Hmm. Um, oh, time flies when you're having fun, and unfortunately we're out of time, Amanda. What do you want to leave listeners with?
Oh, my goodness. Well, first of all, this is really fun. I know we should hang out sometime, Olga.
I
We can
love,
nerd out
yes.
about more stuff. Oh, what do I want to leave folks with? I mean, I'm conscious that I sort of started out with a lot of like these are all the really tough things that are happening, And then I was speaking to some of our like nervous system dysregulation. And so I think the thing I want to leave Vermonters with is just recognizing like all of the beauty in Vermont, Like we are such an incredibly like handy and creative and generous like community and
Hmm.
state. Like the ways in which the stories I've heard over and over again of the ways that people have leaned in incredible generosity for organizations, for their neighbors, the ways that they are like helping to build houses for each other or to like care for one another's kids and all of that. Like that is all, I think we got this. We're
Yeah.
gonna be okay, no matter what. I think no matter what, just keep looking out for each other.
Hmm.
Don't give in to like division or this idea that like, yeah, your neighbors are the problem. I think I really believe like together we have everything we need. And if we're willing to be aggressively generous with like our skills and our resources and our care for one another, we're gonna get through this.
Well, thank you, Amanda. If people want to find out more about you and your platform, where can they find more information?
So, if you want to find out more, go to Janoo for VT. That's FORVT. And you can see my website, you can get involved. We've got, we're headed towards the primary. So we're headed all over the state. So it'd be wonderful if you can join an event that's coming up. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you on the campaign trail.
Thank you very much. As a reminder, everyone, the primary is August 11th. So we might be getting a little close to the time that you could mail back your paper ballot if you have one right now. But remember, you can vote in person at your town clerk's office as well as on the day of the primary. So in the meantime, folks, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW every Friday at 2 p.m. Rebroadcasted on Wednesday mornings on BCTV and wherever you find your podcasts. So take care and have a good weekend.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.